Hi, Todd. So there is a point in the book that I totally agree with, where you say care is what ties us most profoundly to the world. And I think that's a really true statement. But I think we disagree about what constitutes care. So why don't you begin by explaining what you think care is, and then we'll go from there.
Good. And let me say this, because that word care, as you know, right, it is used in lots of different contexts. So let me distinguish caring about from caring for, just to put some terms on, okay? And what I was focused on was really much more about caring about than caring for, although that's, as we'll see in a minute, that's going to be an artificial division, okay? So to care about something is a subjective relation, it focuses on the subjective side of something relational, okay? Right, to care about something means there has to be an object of care, something about which you care. So you're in relationship to that thing. And what I try to get at, particularly in the first chapter, is what I would call caring about.
Okay.
But if you care about something, you've got to, in most cases, you've got to care for it as well, right? Somehow that caring about is an expression of, the caring for is an expression of something you care about. And Joan, I say in most cases, because I can imagine somebody caring a lot about a sports team, for instance, right? It mattering a lot to them how the sports team does. I'm from New York. I was a fan of the Knicks. I lived and died by the New York Knicks, but there was nothing I could do for the New York Knicks, right? So caring for, I think in most cases, is going to be a necessary expression of caring about something. But if we just say caring for, I worry a little bit about the possibility that somebody is taking care of somebody else, but it's simply a job. It's just something that they have to do because they're required to do it. So I think that caring for is in most cases necessary as an aspect of caring about. If you're not caring for it, right, you're probably not caring about it. But that that caring for also, on the other hand, requires a caring about.
Okay. So in the text, you actually say there are two important pieces of care: the importance of the object of care and a sense of loss if that object of care is threatened. Maybe you could talk a little about this sense of loss.
Yeah, and I do, and I'm really curious as to how you're going to react to that as well, because you focused a lot on the activity, right? But I'm sure you know as well as I do that activity also has an emotional aspect to it, right? If one is engaged in caring, right? So the idea is this, that if I'm caring, if it's important to me, then if something bad happens to it, it's not as though I'm just going to look and say, okay, that's too bad that happened. It's going to somehow impact me, and that's part of the relational part, right? That I'm not so distant from the object of my care that anything bad that happens to it is going to leave me without any particular reaction to it. So I will feel a sense of loss if something bad happens, and it by something bad we don't mean this terrible that they get killed or something like that. It could be a person that I care about gets humiliated somehow, right? Like like you have a kid, right? And the kid is playing baseball, and the kid does a terrible job, and the other kids get angry at him. I will feel a sense of loss there. So I think the loss runs in tandem with the relationality, right? That's going to go back to, or will eventually perhaps bring us back to the issues of Buddhism, Stoicism, but that's the initial view, right? But I do want to ask you how you see in caring, because you think of it often as an activity, right? How you see the sense of loss, if you see, or whether you see a sense of loss as necessary to the kind of caring that you think about.
Well, I think loss is intrinsic and inherent to caring. And care is never perfect. It's always imperfect. And indeed, recently I'm thinking much more about what I'm calling bad care than about what other people are trying to define as good care, because I think we can learn a lot more from bad care. But I think one of the big differences between your approach and mine, Todd, is where you started by saying that caring about is the subjective side. And honestly, what I've done from the beginning of my writing about care is try to de-emphasize the subjective side, because we are very good at making ourselves the center of the universe. And the thing about care is that it requires that we somehow decenter ourselves at least a bit and take as our concern something else, another person, an object, a group of people, an idea, anything that's not necessarily just ourselves. Now, I agree with Harry Frankfurt that what makes us who we are is what we've decided to be about, what we decide to care about. And that's really, in a way, how you really could define who we are. Again, care is what ties us most profoundly to the world. So if you know what people think about or care about, you know a lot about them. But to me, that's not the important thing about care. To me, the important thing about care is the actual work of care, the doing, and this other side, which is really interesting that you didn't talk about very much. And it's actually the piece I pick up from Michel Foucault, who you talk about a little bit in the chapter about ourselves. And that is thinking of ourselves not as the caregiver, but as the care receiver. We hardly ever do that. I mean, almost everything that you write in the book is presumed that you're doing the care, that you're the one, the care emanates from you, not the other way. When we turn the world around and look at it from the standpoint of being a recipient of care, we're still talking about care, but we're talking about something that's rather different. To me, it's those two things that make care relational. The fact that we are always in the position of being care receivers, and we're always in the position of being caregivers. And it's that relationality, that relationship of care, that is really the critical thing for us to be looking at.
Good. Now, there's two things I want to ask, but first, I got to ask you, right? Bad care. Could you say something about bad care and what's interesting to you about it?
Okay. I'm trying to think whether I should get up and stop my dog from barking. Sorry, she's interrupting everything.
No, look, Joan, I care about your dog. Don't worry about your dog.
Easy. Stop it. Stop it. Come here. I have no idea why she's barking her head off, but sorry.
She's just looking at my chapter on care and non-human animals, and she has some questions about it.
She does. We discussed it actually. So bad care happens all the time. And already back in Moral Boundaries, I wrote about some of the dimensions of care that can go really wrong. Care can go really wrong when caregivers are paternalistic, when caregivers are parochial. And increasingly, it seems to me that, so here's where I am these days. We know what the problems of the world are. We don't need to redefine justice again. We know what that is, and we know what injustice looks like. Although it's really helpful sometimes to get really good new descriptions of what it looks like, I agree. Same thing with care. We think we know what care is, but it is often the unintended consequences of what we take to be good care that are causing bad care and injustice elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let me give you a more concrete example.
Yeah.
Suppose you live here in New York State and you live in Scarsdale. You think it's fabulous that school funding is done on the basis of property tax because you live in a rich town. If you live in New York City, not very far away, the tax base is much lower, the number of students is much larger, the amount of money per student is much lower. And as a result, students get a much worse education in New York City than they get in Scarsdale. And then it will be that way because of money, right?
Mhm.
So you're living in New York, you get married, you have some kids, you say, you know what, I got to move to Scarsdale. Because my kids, I want my kids to go to public school, but I don't want them to go to these crappy public schools. So I have to move out of town. To me, that's a kind of care, right? You're caring for your own kids, but it's also a bad care. And if we live in a society where everybody's decisions about care are based on the kind of individualistic decisions about what's good for us, the end result is a really uncaring society.
Good. And actually, what strikes me in what you said about this is it's not just that we can do bad care for ourselves. We can do bad care for other people that we care that we care about, like our kids, right?
We
So,
can.
in other words, it's individualistic, but it's not necessarily self-centered.
That's right. That's right. And it can be, yeah, it can be directed towards the good of another or good of another group, but it still turns out to be really bad care.
Okay,
The
good.
only way to fix that, of course, is through having a feedback loop of one sort or another, where caregivers and care receivers actually talk about the quality of care, where others who are engaged outside of a given act of care are able somehow to participate in talking about what care is about.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think this becomes very political also at the stage of grassroots organizing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Where you have, the term of allies is often used, right? Right. I mean,
Right.
the allies who are caring for and about, right, those with whom they're in solidarity.
Right. And
Yeah.
bystanders who do nothing are also engaged in a kind of bad care, I would say.
Yeah. I suppose what I would wonder, because of what we talked about earlier, is whether we'd even call it caring, right?
Yeah.
But now let me, John, let me swing back to something you said earlier about the relationality, mutuality of caring, right? This would be my worry about it, and I'm sure you've already thought about this. I think it's possible. You said caring really happens with the mutuality of it, right? And I think that there is that mutuality of caring, but I think you can also have caring without mutuality, right? Someone can care about and for someone else, even if the other person, right, is not engaged in caring back. In other words, a carer can engage in caring without necessarily receiving it. It seems to me, right? And so, for
Without
instance,
the other
go ahead,
person.
go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for instance, right, uh, one can care about, say, one's kids, right, or care about someone that one really loves who doesn't return the love, or the kid who rejects the parent for, it could be any number of reasons. One of them, I suppose, Joan, now I think about it, maybe bad care by the parent, right?
Right.
But so I don't think, I think caring when it's good care and it's mutual, right, is that's a kind of pinnacle of human relationship. But I think you can have caring that is one-sided, not in the sense it's not relational, because there's the object of care, right? But in this in the sense that it's not returned, not received, right? And I think because I was focusing on what I call caring about, right, that I was trying to see that and open that phenomenon wider in that sense, that you can care about something that doesn't care back for you, right? I think one of the things that you
Well,
focused on,
yeah.
go ahead.
In Moral Boundaries, I suggested that caring about is the first stage of care, the first phase of care, when you kind of are attentive to the needs that need to be met. But it's not until you actually do something that you're actually completing the act of care. So if you care about something but don't do anything about it, you haven't really cared, I would say.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that I want to say I think that's true, Joan, in most cases. But let me give you a case that we can chew over here, right?
Okay.
So I open the the book with the surfer dude, right? Self-described surfer dude, right?
Surfer dude, love him. Liked him in Philip Paraisa's work too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So, and this is a guy who he cared about surfing, right?
Right,
It mattered to him, right? Now, I asked, okay, suppose you couldn't surf anymore, right? Something happened to you.
right,
Uh, I said, you still care about it, right? You still care about the fact that there was surfing going on. That would matter to you, and it would be a loss to you if it weren't.
right.
Yeah. So I said, okay, so if surfing were to stop, right? Like all of a sudden, climate crisis made it impossible because I'll make this up, because the climate crisis made the waves so big, so much energy in the atmosphere that you couldn't ever safely surf, right?
Okay.
I think I feel comfortable to say that because I know nothing about surfing, right? So um, I would say in that case, the caring still goes on, right? Not as the first stage, but as the only stage, right? Because that's all that it's still caring, but it's not something that can rise to the level of the flourishing, caring relationship, right? You've described. So I think what we're doing
Well,
is not arguing about. We're seeing different angles or different aspects of caring, right?
I think you're
Although,
right,
yeah,
but
but
Surfer Dude has a history,
yeah, yeah.
and that history is part of him,
Oh
which is
yeah,
the reason why, if it were to disappear, it would be he would be very saddened, right?
yes,
So so the ongoing care isn't in a moment. It isn't a single momentary thing. It's over a lifetime. It's over the course of maybe a family's lifetime, maybe many people's lifetimes. But at any rate, it doesn't just occur at one moment. And so that's why I would say caring about, in the sense of just saying, I read a story in the paper this morning and I'm really concerned about all those refugees. Isn't really caring very much, right? It's little, but it's not very much. Doing something about it, whether you send money, whether you open your house and let refugees in, all of those kinds of things are much more robust acts of care. I guess part of the issue that is underneath all this really comes to this question about the nature of philosophy itself and what we think we're doing when we engage in this kind of philosophical clarity of ideas. And for me, we're always already out in the boat floating along, and we've got nothing else to fix it with except what we've got with us.
mm-hmm.
And it's always the case that we're engaged in caring relations. We're always, at the very least, as able adults, we're always caring for ourselves. Because if we don't eat, sleep, find shelter, we're gonna, not exist.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at least caring for ourselves all the time. We're often usually also caring for others, right? And if we're engaged in this process of caring, then moral dilemmas occur almost every moment of every day about whether we're caring enough, whether we're caring the right way, whether we're doing it properly, and so on. I mean, raising children, I haven't, but every day there's something you did wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
You just know that didn't go as well as that didn't go the way I thought it would, but it's still care. And I guess what I want to do is, if you make more normal the ongoing thinking about the ways in which this is a philosophical activity in which we relate to, care for, take care of others, take care of the natural world and other people and other animals and the environment as well. Yeah.
Good. Let me approach that, but I have to tell you, right? So I saw a comic recently. It was a two-panel
Yes.
comic, right?
Okay.
First panel, right, is a bunch of philosophers sitting around, right? And somebody says philosophy is really important, and everybody agrees with them, right? Like,
Of
right?
course.
And the second panel, somebody says, "Well, what is philosophy?" And they're all attacking one another. So
Yes, good, go ahead.
but I see philosophy as fundamentally a reflective activity, right? Which you've just given examples. Am I caring enough? Am I not? So
Right.
it's a reflective activity where you step back from the immediacy of your engagements
Yes,
and ask and assess them about. And I think the you can see that in the questions you've raised. But I want to put another one on the table as well, right? Am I caring enough? Am I caring in the right way? Things like that. But there's another one, which is, do I care, right? Which is to say, is this important to me? Okay. And in the book, that's, I think, the one I centered on, or
yes.
the background question that I centered on the most, right? Is this something that is important to my life? Because one of the things that happens, John, and I mean, everybody knows this, that with social media and the 24-hour news cycle and the attention-driven economy, I think it's easier than it once was, right? To step back. I mean, sorry, to fail to step back because your attention's always being taken up one place and another, right?
Right.
And so what I think philosophy can do is allow us to step back and ask ourselves, do I care about this, right? I used to do for many years training in grassroots organizing, right?
Mhm.
Train groups in grassroots organizing. And you'll be entirely unsurprised to know that right after Trump got elected, right, I asked to go all over the place to do grassroots training. And one of the things I used to say was, Trump is going to say something outrageous every day, right? And you're going to, and if you follow that, you're going to get hysterical. So
Mhm.
what you need to do is find out, what's the thing I care about, right? What's of all these things that are going wrong, what's the one I care about, and how might I make that better? But that's a reflective activity. So I think you're right. Philosophy is a reflective activity. Ask just the questions you're asking. It also asks the question, what do I care about? And that's the one that I said the book focuses on. I think your work focuses a lot on what you said, caring about is the first stage, right? The other stages and other ways that might happen as I would put it, right, expressions of caring about that happen in caring for, right?
Right.
So I think I would put it this way. I think we have disagreements maybe at the edges. I'm not sure we have disagreements at the core.
No, yeah, that's probably right. But one of the places where that difference of approach might come up is in thinking about ideas of responsibility. For me, responsibility is intrinsic and inherent to caring for. And once you agree that there's something you want to care about, you then have to take responsibility or understand where the responsibility lies for that caring that's going to happen. And if you're going to take responsibility seriously, responsibility then again is a relational concept. It's different from an obligation, right? And the interesting thing is you start from the question, what do I owe to others? What should I care about? And I want to say that question it's kind of like Marx being critical in the German ideology about the just so questions, just so stories. We're always already enmeshed in relations of care. We're already enmeshed in responsibilities. And we're in those responsibilities, then we need to start from there. So that's why I guess it is a difference of emphasis, but that's why I don't take your question to be the right one to start from, I guess.
And the way I would see it is that if I don't take responsibility,
yeah,
that's an indication to somebody that I don't care about it.
Exactly.
And one of the things that I think care ethics has emphasized, right, that you have emphasized, right, and that Carol Gilligan has emphasized, that I think is really important. We haven't talked about this, right? It's been implicit in one moment in our conversation where we talked about that to care means you have a history of relationships, right?
Right.
But oftentimes, as you know, a traditional liberal theory acts as though we're individuals that somehow come together. And I know there are arguments about that's not a metaphysical claim, it's a methodological claim, but nevertheless, it's easy to ignore that. And I think one of the things that care ethics has done, and I mentioned it in the book about that you've talked about it, Virginia Hell has talked about it. It's implicit, if not explicit, in Carol Gilligan's work, is the fact that relationality is, we're born into relationality, right? Right.
Right. Exactly.
Right. We're not born behind a veil of ignorance, right? So we're born into relationality, and that has ethical implications for us. And even if you defend a sort of liberal view from the perspective it's methodological, it's not metaphysical. Even if you do that, nevertheless, the threat is to miss, right, the moral character, the ethical character of the fact that we're always already in relationship to others.
Right. Right.
And
right.
and what may happen later is relationships that I was brought up in about things I ought to care about
Right.
are not things that I will find myself actually caring about. And I used to see this at Clemson, because Clemson's in rural South Carolina, and in sending it and in rural South Carolina, there were students who were brought up that they should care about certain very conservative religious, right, practices and participation and relationships, that they came to see. Although that's part of my history, when I reflectively step back, right, I realized this is not important to me. And if I lost it, right, it would not be important to me.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to recognize why I think this is why the relational piece and why the responsibility piece are so important.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, here's the thing, and Joan, you shouldn't have to say this, because I should be the one to say this, right? There's a reason that care ethics has not yet found the centrality that it, and it's because women do it. Women have been writing about it, right? I mean, you know this, and I know this, right?
Yes, it's true.
But you shouldn't have to be the one to say it, right? It seems to me that like if Bernard Williams, right, started writing about care ethics, everybody would be talking about it.
Well, there are some guys who have written about care ethics, of course.
Oh, of course,
Yeah.
but the pioneers in this have all been women.
Yeah. We're almost it's almost time to take questions, but I do want to ask you to talk for a moment about Buddhists and Stoics.
Okay, because this gets very complicated, right?
Yeah.
The question could be, here's how the question could come up. If caring involves, among other things, a sense of loss, to oneself, if the object of care is threatened, what does that mean for Buddhist caring and Stoics caring? The official Buddhist doctrine, right, is that caring, that we suffer because there was dukkha, we crave, we desire, and so you have to step away from that. Also Stoics, right? I mean, one of Epictetus's pieces of advice was, before you put your kid to bed every night, imagine the kid has died overnight, and you keep imagining this so that it becomes easier for you, right, in the morning to deal with, if you have to deal with it. And I don't want to. If you say that Buddhists and Stoics don't care, that seems there's something a bit off about that, right? Because they engage in lots of, coming back to your work, lots of activities that seem to involve caring and mattering. Okay, what at least on the official doctrines, right, they don't have is that emotional relationship to it.
Right.
And so what I want to say is that it seems to me a kind of caring, but not the kind of caring that most of us would actually want, right? That's to say, it's a kind of caring that if that if my reaction to loss was as distant as the official doctrines would like, I would wonder about myself and my relationship to the object. So in the end, I want to say with Aristotle, Aristotle had a great phrase, in general and for the most part, right? So, right, it seems to be in general and for the most part, caring involves a sense of loss to oneself if the object is threatened. But I don't want to say it necessarily has to, or it isn't caring anymore. It does seem to me it's possible it's caring. It just seems to me a kind of caring that I would feel, and I think most people would feel distant from, right? And I think most people, by the way, who take up and utilize Stoic and Buddhist doctrine don't go the distance of the official doctrines, right? They find it helpful, but they're not going to go to that point of invulnerability.
I'm thinking of the Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism, in which Weber, of course, argues that if you really followed the doctrine, you wouldn't arrive at this idea at all, but this is where they ended up. And
yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah. This is, we could do this for hours, couldn't we?
Good. I think
we probably should go for the Q&A, yes?
Yeah, I think we should.
Kate asks, does care, either caring about or caring for, require hope? So what is the link between care and hope? Todd, do you want to start on that, and then we can move
but I do want to hear what Joan has to say about this as well. I mean, it's a great question. So I'm going to let me put it this way. I'm going to give an immediate reaction, right? And if it turns out that I'm wrong, I'll just deny I ever said it, right? So it seems to me that caring, my immediate view is that caring probably does require hope, right? In the sense that because caring is often, it can be based on a history, as Joan was emphasizing, but it's also forward-looking. That it seems to require the idea, right, that something can come of this activity of expression that I'm engaged in, right? I'm trying to think of a counterexample here. So I suppose I can imagine someone who cares about someone that they have no hope that caring will be returned, right? But yet and still, that seems to me, except under really extreme circumstances, like Kierkegaard and Regina, except under really extreme circumstances, that seems to me the point at which caring is likely to begin to dissolve, right? So I think hope is, if it's not conceptually necessary to caring, it seems to me in practical cases, almost always a necessary element in caring. John, how would you react to that?
Yeah, I think hope is also a part of care. That is, you can, insofar as care is forward-looking, at the very least, it's about meeting needs, and meeting needs hopefully creates the conditions where those needs are met and new needs arise, or you look and see if you've solved the problem that you were trying to solve. All of those things, there's a hope that some good outcome will be achieved. So yeah, I would say that hope is kind of intrinsic to care. Can you care in a hopeless situation, or can you care in a way that's relatively hopeless? Sure, and that would probably be bad care. That is, if you kind of went every day and just did a job of taking care of a person who was older, you're pretty sure this person is going to die any day anyway, and so what am I going to do? But I think most of us would say that to care well in that situation, you still hope for the best for that person and not for the worst or no outcome, or be indifferent to the outcome for that person. And under those conditions, I'd say, yeah, care involves hope.
Right.
I hadn't thought of it that way. It's a nice question. Thank you.
Yeah, but I just to stay with it, right, Joan, I think in that case, the hopelessness case, right, that would be one of those cases where the caring, because because of the hopelessness, doesn't necessarily find an expression in a certain activity.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it does find its expression in a certain activity. You
Oh,
show
go
up,
ahead.
you go visit the person, you
Okay.
bring them a glass of water, even though you know they can't drink. You offer to do something for them they can't accept, but you still do.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what we do, right? That's what we do.
And let me swing back to the other side of it. So bad care can also, I mean, hopelessness can involve bad care, but bad care can also involve hope.
Too much hope, yes, or misplaced hope, or
Misplaced hope.
yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. So there's two questions that pick up on the link between care and care ethics. So Ellie asks, would you consider the ethics of care to be part of virtue ethics? And Alice asks to clarify the relationship between care ethics and other ethical frameworks. And then as an additional part of the question, is care ethics an alternative to these, or does it operate at a different level to the other ones like Kantian or utilitarian? So Joan, do you want to have a first crack at that? And then we can move to Todd.
Okay, I had to tell you, I'm a political theorist. I'm not a philosopher. I haven't been steeped in the ethical traditions the way you all have. And so I'm never really sure how to answer this question. A fair number of writers who do care ethics do think of care as a part of virtue ethics and argue that care is a particular kind of virtue that goes beyond some of the other virtues, and which makes us expand virtue beyond the virtue of, especially for Aristotle, the exceptional individual, to expanding it to everybody and indeed to groups rather than just individuals. So that answer is one that seems okay to me. I don't, again, I'm not a philosopher. I don't really have a stake in this. I often don't say I'm talking about care ethics as much as care theory anymore, because I think the language of ethics kind of puts us in a frame where we have to answer these questions that I don't think are necessarily the important questions to answer. I've often thought that care ethics is a kind of consequentialist ethic, rather because we're concerned with outcomes, we're concerned with meeting ends, we're concerned with making the care happen rather than a virtue ethics. But that's a question for a different day. It's clearly not deontological. I think we can say that.
Yeah, and I would say it's not broadly consequentialist either, right? But let me swing back to the virtue ethics.
Sure.
What Joan said, and I think this seems to be exactly right, is that the Aristotelian virtue ethics was a matter of what the individual was like, right? Developing the individual, right? It was in relation to the world, but the fundamental aspect of it was the development of the individual. Now, what other philosophical theories of ethics, and traditionalist, consequentialist, and deontological, what they have often missed is the emotional, relational components. Okay, so as a consequentialist, first, I'm concerned with causing the best consequences. I don't have to care about those. I just have to know what they are.
Yeah.
And if I know what they are and I cause them, if it doesn't matter to me, well, that's fine, right? But I think that emotional relationship is important. And to give you one example of it, right? One of the problems associated with ethics and a person who's diagnosed as sociopathic is people who's diagnosed as sociopathic have problem of care. They have problems with emotional relationships with others. And so they have trouble seeing their way to what the experience of another person might be. And I think care ethics helps to fill that space in. Right? And I would say the same with the Kantian ethics. I sometimes tell my students, you can be a misanthrope. You can hate every human being in existence and still be a good Kantian.
Yeah.
Because you're acting according to the principles. So I think on the one hand, with ethics, I think care brings in something that often goes missing in other ethical theories. But on the other hand, I think it's also in some sense wider. There's this overlap in which, right, you're not obliged to care about many of these things. It doesn't tell you what things you're supposed to care about. So it characterizes, I think, the human experience in a way that on the one hand helps us to fill gaps in ethical theory, but on the other hand, goes wider and in some sense is underneath because it addresses our fundamental relationships with the world around us.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, so Catherine has a question here, which is a practical question, I guess. How do we go about embedding care in all societal institutions? What are some starting places or steps to take? So, Joan, do you want to have a initial
Oh,
reflection on
Joan's the expert on this. This is right in Joan's ballpark.
Yeah, so it is the case that institutions can either act in caring ways or uncaring ways. And as individuals who take part in institutions, we can make it more possible for institutions to care well or less possible for institutions to care well. Some things we can do. 1, clear lines of responsibility. 2, the more democratic and the less hierarchical organizations are, the more likely they are to be able to manifest and foster care. And 3rd, organizations have to be committed to what it is they're trying to accomplish, and to do that in a way that's also caring about the people within the organization. So those are just 3 things that institutions can do. And think of any institution you know, and you can pretty much start counting ways they could do all of those 3 things better. Yeah. It's a complicated question because although we live in a society we call democratic, it's not very democratic. But I'll tell you one example that really always stands out to me, and it's the ways in which pilots are now trained. And it goes back to the time when, they have these voice recorders, so they know what happens when planes crash. And what they discovered was that when things started going bad, nobody dared tell the captain that something was wrong. I got a reading that's not right on this machine, because they just didn't want to be the one who kind of got yelled at for saying, there's something wrong. What they did instead was to normalize there's something wrong. And once they did, and to empower everybody on the team to say that. And once they did that, they discovered that then the captain would have to make a decision, yes, but that they discovered that then they would all agree on how to solve the problem. And it would actually happen. Doctors and nurses, when you ask them about an operating room and you say, is there good communication? The doctors say yes, the nurses say no. What does that tell us? There really isn't. So when Atul Gawande developed this checklist and he was going to take it to places in the third world where they don't do surgery as much and it's not as good. And then he practiced in his own practice as a surgeon, and he discovered that empowering everybody in the room to say, hey, we skipped step 3, made that step 3 wasn't skipped. And even his own surgeries went better once he created a checklist and let everybody participate in the process. So that's an example of how democratizing the process of doing the job well, taking responsibility and sharing it, is a way of making care better. So maybe that's an example, some examples that help.
Thanks. Todd, do you have anything you want to pick up on in what Joan says, or any other reflections on Catherine's question?
Just one quick one that I think Joan would be sympathetic with. Institutions, particularly institutions that are hierarchical, are generally not keen on trying to create more areas of care, right?
Exactly.
Right. And so that I think the caring often has to come from below, and part of the caring can be confrontational, right? To care about something, it may be to involve confrontation. I used to say in my trainings that people in power will give up that power when it's more comfortable for them to give it up than to stay the same, right?
Exactly.
And that's going to require caring from below in order to change the hierarchical character and introduce some of these free elements that Joan talked about.
Exactly. Yeah, it's almost always the case. I mean, one of the things about care ethics, it is a philosophy that comes from below. I think.
Yeah. And
And that's one of the things that's engaged me about it for my entire life. Yeah.
Thank you. So this is definitely a capital P philosophical style question. So I'll send it to Todd first, and then Joan can offer any responses after that. So this is from Eddie, who asks, can you say a bit more about how your views align with or diverge from accounts of caring that tie it more directly to responsibility and free will than ethics? So Eddie's examples are Sripada and Shoemaker drawing on Harry Frankfurt. So for example, they try to define the attitude of caring in terms of attention and emotional dispositions.
And my job is to react to
I'm afraid so, Todd.
that.
You can find the question in the Q&A button if you want to kind of like reread it.
Let me just sort out a bit, right? To put my cards on the table a little bit, okay? I found Harry Frankfurt's view of caring to be really compelling until I read Jaworska's. Right? And her view of it as a complex emotion that's relational seems to me to capture something that Frankfurt didn't capture, because his was a bit, if I could use the word, intellectualist. Okay, so the idea of attending and attention and focus, I think, is right, but I think it needs to be supplemented with the kind of relational. And I'm not familiar with Sripada, so I'm not going to comment on that. With the kind of emotional relationship. But one of the things that Jaworska points out is that we want to distinguish oftentimes between emotions and emotional episodes, right? So grief can be an emotion that happens over time, right? And caring that involves grief is going to involve an emotion that happens over time. But there can be moments where you're sad or you cry or you something like that. And what she wants to say is that caring is an emotion that can manifest itself in emotional episodes at different times. And so it's in a sense, she wants to say it's a higher level emotion to care about something, right? Now, this is going to be, don't come back, this is the caring about, right? More than the caring for, but it's a higher level emotion that happens in such a ways to have particular episodes over time that manifest or that express that caring, but that's going to involve the ongoing historical relationship to something, right? I mean, as Joan said earlier, I don't read the papers and then care, right? Unless I somehow was already historically oriented to that caring in the first place.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add to that, Joan?
No, I agree with Todd that the problem with Frankfurt's is that it's too intellectualist, if you let me use that language that you used, and it's too focused on the self, whereas really thinking about care means not only thinking about oneself. See, once again, this is I care about, what is it I care about, not what cares about me, which is the other side of it, and which is also a part then of our history, of our care understandings, of how our emotional life developed, all of those things. And if you leave that piece out, you're leaving out a really important part of the story.
Thank you. And for those of you in the Q&A who asked about who Todd was referencing, it was someone called Agnieszka Jaworska, and I'm just going to put her academic homepage in there. So I thought we'd end, as we've just got maybe a minute to go, with a sort of simple question from anonymous attendee, but I think it'll give a good opportunity for some like punchy blue sky thinking style final words. Why should I care, Joan?
It's not a sensible question to ask. You do care. You're already engaged in relations of care. The question isn't why should you, but how should you?
And I'll just add to Joan, and the other question is, what should you care about? Yeah, what should you care about and how should you care about it?
Okay, so you're both of the opinion that the question, why should I care, is not a sensible question because we are already engaged in those kind of relationships.
Oh,
If you've lived past infancy as a human being, you've been engaged in caring, period. You're alive.
And I would just add, if that's an important question to the questioner, right, the caring is already happening.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're pretty much at time. Todd, do you have any final reflections based on the conversation, based on any of the things that came up in the questions or anything like that?
Just this. All right. Look, I'm just a guy who was, I've been philosophically care adjacent, right? I hope my kids don't think I'm care adjacent, but philosophically care adjacent, right? And so my ability to write about any of this hinges on people like Joan and the work that she's done, right, to clear the ground, to erect philosophical / political views, right, that allow me avenues of thought that I would not have otherwise had.
Well, thank you, Todd, but I'm going to end with your sentence. Care is what ties us most profoundly to the world. And I think that's a good place to end.